talking about complex geometry. It's incredible. And so we've got these individual chapters done by specialists who we went to them and said, look, this is how these climate scientists have used your area of speciality into their climate picture. And we want you to show how they've completely misused. Now, of course, McIntyre won't speak out about this because he likes to think, and he's right up to a point, that this could have been done simply because people were ignorant and didn't understand what they were doing. Having a formula and plugging numbers in when you don't know what you're doing. But when you see that being done time and time again in area after area, there's a pattern, what the old police call the modus operandi. And when you read all of the IPCC reports, you see this pattern everywhere you look of deliberate misuse of specialized areas. So that's the pattern of the book and why it's subtitled The Death of the Greenhouse, because, of course, the greenhouse theory is at the basis of the whole global warming climate change argument.
And I must tell you, being Kim Greenhouse, it's a pleasure to be sorting the wheat from the chaff with you about this. I'm tired of my name being impugned.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Absolutely. And greenhouses have been very, very beneficial to mankind, as are your programs.
Thank you so much. One last question for you. I know we've been talking a long time. How come you think it is that there's no wiggle room in academia to be wrong?
There's a couple of reasons for that. One is, of course, that we've allowed universities to become isolated. You know, one of the things that's interesting about human nature is that when it becomes separated from the main body, it stultifies. It stops changing. Now, I'll give you a completely separate example of this. Languages. Once English left England and came to the U.S. and other parts of the world, it stuck. So if you watch McNeill of McNeill and Lear, he did a book on the history of English, and he's got sections in there showing that the language of areas of Appalachia is Elizabethan English, the pronunciation, the grammars, and so on. If you go to Quebec, Quebecers speak medieval French. Even the structure of the sentences is medieval and more like English. Whereas in France, of course, the language, and back in England, the languages became dynamic. And I first had a personal experience of this, reading the records of the Hudson Bay Company and reading the journals from the 18th century. And they're using terminology that is no longer used in England, yet they're English people. For example, they talk about the men's apartments. Apartments don't exist in England. They're now called flats. To be a little off color for a second, they talk about son of a bitch. Well, me growing up in England, that was strictly an American slang. You didn't hear that in England. And of course, what's happened with universities, they had what was called the town and gown fights back in the Middle Ages, where they were battling for academic freedom and independence. And of course, they finally achieved that. But they've now become the ivory towers, completely detached from reality and relevance and so on, even to the point where they have defined intelligence in such a narrow way that it denigrates most of the population. I mean, one of the things that infuriates me is that, and you do it in the U.S., we do it in Canada, they do it in Britain, this assumption that every child that comes out of kindergarten is going to go to university is absolute rubbish. University is a very narrow way of thinking and analyzing and dealing with things, but by doing that, you then denigrate anybody else that doesn't get into university. So they have become completely isolated, and of course, with that isolation, you get inbreeding.
And arrogance, tremendous arrogance.
Arrogant beyond belief, because, you know, my intelligence is the only form of intelligence, and if you don't have that, can't possibly be right. And by the way, there are some lovely social examples of pricking this pomposity. The movie Crocodile Dundee. It was all about the fact that here was some yobbo from the outback, could survive very nicely in New York, but a New Yorker couldn't survive in the outback of Australia. And yet who's calling who primitive? You know? And so it was a wonderful moral story about defining of intelligence. And by the way, most of the successful CEOs like Bill Gates and so on, they're usually university dropouts. And the only ones that have stayed in academia is the highest percentage are ones that have got PhDs in history, a generalist discipline, or philosophy, a generalist discipline. And so, of course, being a good CEO, you don't have to know how to make the widgets or work the machine, but you do have to know how to make what that widget maker does productive for the whole company. Everywhere you look, you see that universities have become so inbred and yet so dominate. And of course, it's no surprise that it's within those universities that, like East Anglia or Penn State, that these people have been able to carry out their corruption. If they did what they did in any other public walk of life other than government, they'd be fired instantly.
If you were to discover through your own investigation that there was a warming that was potentially dangerous, would you shift gears? Would you be public about it?
Two parts of that. One is, yes, I have always absolutely forced myself to say, if you find that you're wrong, you must be the first person out there saying you were wrong. You have to. If you don't keep that in the forefront of your thinking, you are so vulnerable to becoming a victim of your own biases. So absolutely. The other part of that question, of course, speaks to a problem of creating panic amongst people. Back when Reagan was the president, the U.S. Geology Society said, look, we need a political decision here. If we have research that suggests there's going to be a big earthquake, let's say in San Francisco, and we tell you about it, and it costs billions to move the people out and deal with the problem, and then it doesn't happen, are we legally liable? Or the converse, if we have information where we are pretty sure there's going to be an earthquake, and we don't tell you about it, and then it's discovered that we knew and didn't do anything, are we equally legally liable? And of course, this is the challenge of information that is potentially threatening. And of course, it's why the abuse of the sky is falling theme by these people with the climate thing is so egregious. I wrote an article a little while ago which I titled, What Happens When Chicken Little Cries Wolf? to mix metaphors. Of course, the answer to the situation is that if you have that kind of information, the first thing you do is go out and talk to as many people as you possibly can. It's, again, the basis of what you are doing and why it's so valuable. You're just saying, okay, here's an issue. Well, I'll have that person on, but I want counter views. I want somebody else to give their view of it. A lot of times when I give talks now, Kim, I don't say good morning, I say morning. Make up your own mind. Who am I to tell you whether it's good or bad? This is the problem. There's so many people willing to tell us what to think and how we feel, and it's part of this same syndrome. So very, very big challenge for society, and particularly problematic when people exploit it on a global scale.
What do you think we're going to do since the EPA now has the right to invoke punishment?
Well, of course, what the Obama administration has done is bypass the politicians. The Founding Fathers, they understood all of these things, and they couldn't understand everything of it, but they set up a system. By the way, Jefferson, for example, he didn't think any government was going to last more than 20 years. They'd all fail through corruption or getting too caught up in things. But the reason that they set up the frequent elections the way they did was to prevent any kind of demagoguery. And, of course, the recent elections in the U.S. were a good example of that here was somebody that for the majority of people was taking them in the wrong direction. So they had a chance, thanks to the Founding Fathers, to stand up and speak out about it. But as I said earlier, identifying the problem is one thing. And what we need now is the second part of it, of course, is the motive. And that's the other thing that we try to identify in our book is what was the motive behind this. Then the third thing is, well, what are the solutions? And the first thing is to be calm, sit down, gather all the information, and then set your priorities, because you're not going to deal with every problem that comes up. And of course, this is another reason for the extremism that's gone on. This is a bigger problem. It's the end of the world. And of course, all you're doing is competing with money against other issues like health and education and all of these things.
I'll tell you another reason why there's great resistance to people accepting